Welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us today for the discussion around building the L&D department of the future. I see a lot of familiar names there, so many of you will have met me, be familiar with me, Michelle Ockers. And I'm here today not only in my own right as someone who works with organisations around learning strategy and capability, but also over the course of the year, many of you will know I've formed a relationship with the Learning and Performance Institute based largely around this fantastic tool, the capability map, which we're going to be looking at today to look at how we can use it to build our L&D departments to handle the kind of challenges we've got in the 21st century. So I'm super excited to have had the opportunity to work on the capability map, to be working with a couple of organisations using the capability map now, and also to have built this working relationship with you, Don, as chairman of the LPI. So I'd like you to introduce yourself to everyone, if there's anyone out there who doesn't actually know you already.
Thanks very much, Michelle. It's very kind of you. So I'm Don Taylor, chairman of the LPI, the Learning and Performance Institute here in the UK, and it's good to be with you all. Great to be working with Michelle this year on the capability map. As well as, of course, chairing the LPI, which I've done since 2000, I am the chairman of the Learning and Performance Institute, which now has shows in, conferences in London, Paris, Berlin, Singapore, and elsewhere. But we're here on LPI Business, so let's stick with that and with the capability map and how we can use it to build the Learning and Development Department of the future. Let's move on. Just check everyone knows what they should be doing with the chat, which is to select the chat icon, which is that little speech bubble with the 3 dots in. And when you are chatting, please make sure that you chat to all panelists and attendees. I'm hoping that everyone, by the way, can see us as we move on slides. If there's anything peculiar going on and you can't see the changes to the slides, please let us know in the chat. We're going to start, Michelle, aren't we, with a question. Do you want to just go ahead and read the question out and take it from here?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Don. So the question we want to start chatting about today, because this is all about building departments for the future. So what are the challenges facing your learning and development department today? Because we need to ensure that we're able to help you meet those challenges. So if you can type your responses in the chat box, what challenges is your learning and development department facing?
Maybe no answer, of course, Michelle, in which case it'll be a very short webinar and we can all pack up and go home. I suspect people will have something to say.
Yeah, absolutely. Shelley's kicked us off with measuring impact. Nicole, engagement from stakeholders.
And reduced budget. Unfortunately, these are 3 fairly common things that we find in L&D departments. Lynette says finding good staff. Karina echoes that, lack of resources, budget and people. Kat saying business people thinking learning is the amount of content consumed. Kat, I hear your pain. Doing more with less. Kat says also increasing relevance. So we are relevant, Terry points out, we want to be more relevant. And M says engagement from senior managers. Some common themes coming through here, Michelle, don't you think? Yeah,
absolutely. I'm seeing a lot of doing more with less, a lot around engagement, Don.
Yeah.
A lot around fewer resources, so fewer people in your learning and development department. And from Trevor, expectations that we can turn things around very quickly.
Yes, normally what somebody else has quite unrealistically asked for as well. I want a 30-minute course with e-learning on time management, when in fact, they don't need a course at all. What they need is better management. And shifting, Aaron says, to broader performance focus rather than being a training factory, a fulfillment house. So it's a common issue, isn't it? Please keep the chat coming. But Michelle, do you want to move on and talk about some of the other challenges that we've, or the challenges that we identify in the LPIs that people are facing?
Yeah, absolutely, Don. And some of these certainly echo the comments or the responses we had to that question. And the top one there you see is doing more with less. So many of you will be aware that this year, 6 years after the capability map was launched by the Learning and Performance Institute, there was a refresh done, and we did quite a lot of consultation up front, and we asked the question, you know, in these 6 years, what's changing and what are some of the challenges that L&D departments are facing? So there's quite a few of those that are listed here that came out of our consultation that you've mentioned. already, as well as some additional ones around things like the workforce composition changing, and of course the huge impact these days of technology and being able to harness technology, but still tackling or grappling with some of the challenges of IT infrastructure as well. And database decision making, which I think ties in nicely, Don, with engaging the business, and to Aaron's point around that broader performance focus, rather than just being a training factory, which I think is an aspiration that we're trying to engage our stakeholders with. So when we framed up the capability map, we were very mindful that we needed to provide a view of what can we do, particularly what skills do we need to develop in learning and development in order to meet these challenges. So let's move on then, Don, to the body of the webinar with that context in mind. We've got three components to today's session. The first is to look at that question of 21st century learning and development. Then we'll be taking a brief look at the capability map, this being the second in our series of regional webinars about the capability map. And then the guts of today, and where we want to provide the most value for you, is how to use the capability map to make the kind of shifts needed to address the challenges that we've identified collectively this morning. So, Don.
Thank you very much, Michelle. Great setup. I'm going to kick us off here looking at the first of those three things, the 21st Century Learning and Development Department. When I started doing this job back in the 1980s, it was very straightforward. I stood up in front of a class and I delivered a course that I had written. Tremendously simple, the way it had been done for hundreds of years, in fact, probably more beforehand. But things have changed, and we have got a wider set of skills now in workplace learning and development. In answer to some of those challenges that Michelle laid out for us earlier on, such as volatility and the need to make decisions based on data, digital transformation, we find ourselves with some of the new tasks now land in our lap that you can see on the screen here, as well as, of course, the need to keep delivering traditional course-based training, whether those courses are online or face-to-face. That doesn't go away, unfortunately. We're just landed with a whole bunch of new stuff to do, and this is not by any means an unlimited lot. There is a lot more tasks that people are expected to be carrying out in learning and development. Here are some of the typical learning and development roles that we're familiar with today. Classroom instructor, sure. Learning technology lead, possibly someone to look after your LMS, because an awful lot of companies have those, and so on. But as well as those typical learning and development roles, there are, in addition, some of these emergent roles that we need to be looking at. Performance consultant, a learning experience designer, data analyst, the sort of roles that help us carry out those tasks that we've just delineated, and those tasks help us tackle some of those issues that Michelle spelt out earlier on. Now, I've chaired conferences for 20 years. I see a lot of people talking about stuff, and sometimes we just want a quick sanity check. Is it just the guy on stage talking about this? Does anybody else agree with him? I want to point out that what we're saying here isn't necessarily something new. There are lots of people, names that you will recognize, who are saying the same thing. Charles Jennings, of course, Australian, saying it. Nigel Payne, I think, is both Australian and British, is saying it. Josh Burson's talking about the need to experiment, and even we've got Jane Hart and even Don Taylor there in a black and white picture saying rather dramatically, change or face irrelevance. But I do firmly believe that if we don't increase our skill set, we do run the risk of not going away, that will never happen, but of not being involved in some of the exciting big stuff that's going on in learning development, where we can really make a difference. I think it's a great moment of opportunity for us, and we should, well, step up and take advantage of it if we can. Michelle, do you want to tell us about the Learning and Performance Institute capability map itself?
Absolutely. Thanks, Don. And I think to your point, Don, there, I think what I hear and see in Australia and New Zealand is that people are they're beyond the question around why do we need to change, and they're ready and looking for practical approaches that work to make these changes. And I noticed Lynette saying she needs one person who can do all of this and will work with high financial gain. So It's good to put it out there, Lynette, but we will be talking about, you know, the fact that there's a lot of skills now. You know, the remit of L&D is so wide that being able to step back and take a look at what do you have and what do you need, and using a tool like the capability map is really critical to getting your capability right against your strategy. So, Don, if you can move on for me. A quick recap on where we've come from with the L&D capability map. It was first released in 2012, 6 years on. We've done a refresh. It was a highly consultative process that was used. We took feedback from the 3,200 users who had done an assessment against the capability map in those 6 years, formed a steering group, formed working groups, and Aaron, who's on the call today, was in one of those working groups. Thank you very much for that contribution. If you're interested in who was involved, you can go to the LPI website. We will be sharing a link to that later in the webinar, and we've acknowledged everybody who was involved in those 13 countries across 11 time zones. And what's really interesting is we believe we have come up with a globally relevant set of skills needed by learning and development today. It was launched, the refresh map launched on the 5th of October, and we're going through this period of initial use and consultation, getting feedback from early users to do some minor changes to make sure it's as practical, useful and clear and easy to use as possible in early January, and then planning more regular updates. And I think, Don, we were chatting yesterday, we're getting close to 500 people having completed a self-assessment since the 5th of October. Is that right?
That's right. I wouldn't be surprised if we hit 500 this week.
Yeah, fantastic. We should have a giveaway for the 500th. Special call
No,
out.
it has to be done. It has to be completely altruistic. But you're right when you say people have been using this. I was in the States last week at Elliot Mays' conference, and a guy came up to me and said, Don, I want to tell you, I'm working in Minnesota. I've got my team. It's a small bunch of 3 or 4 people. We're going through it. We're using this map to help us understand where we need to develop ourselves in the future. Michelle, that really did my heart a lot of good.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and I have used the map with small teams before as well. So if we can take a quick look at the capability map itself, it consists of 25 skills divided into 5 categories. So some of the things you'll see, and we'll just pause for a moment and just let you kind of scan through that list of skills. You'll see some of this stuff aligns very much with the challenges that you were talking about earlier today. So in particular, if you look at the support learning category there, it's not all just about being in control and facilitating learning, but trying to introduce learning into the flow of work through approaches such as developing continuous learning skills, and understanding what we need to do to our own skills to support others to learn continually. Under performance and impact, and we've got a whole category on performance and impact, to Aaron's point about shifting to impacting performance more effectively, and what are the skills we need to build up to do that. So we believe that we've captured responses to a lot of those challenges in the capability map. And Don, if we move on, we've got for each of those skills, we've defined what that skill looks like at 4 levels, from foundational through to leading, as you see defined there on the screen. So the capability map itself has a series of statements about behaviours. So we've been very careful to say, if you were looking at someone applying this skill at this level of proficiency, what would you see? So if you were videoing them, what would you observe? If you were sitting there watching them do their work, what would you see? So the aspiration is that makes it a lot easier for you to be able to self-assess, and also if you're a manager and you're using the tool with your team, to be able to have good quality conversations based on evidence from their work as to whether they are or not exhibiting those behaviours, to get your positioning corrected in your self-assessment. So that very brief introduction, many of you will already be familiar, having taken a look at the capability map with some of this structure. Let's talk about how we can put it into action to make the kind of shifts we need to make, Don.
Absolutely. Very good question from John. How much this is covered by education today? How much must the L&D professional learn themselves? Well, we're going to come towards the end, towards individual development plans and so on. But Michelle, I think it's fair to say that in terms of formal education, schooling and university, the vast majority of this is not covered by any form of education. Is that fair enough, Michelle?
Yeah, I think so. You know, a lot of stuff is still emerging and unfolding. So if we look at things like data analytics, you know, some of that's playing catch up. But then if we look at technologies and the use of different technologies and some of the emergent applications of technology to support and enable performance and learning in the workplace, you know, we're ahead of the curve. As well as, I think, from a practical perspective, the value of being connected to others who are experimenting, who are trying things and who are getting good results. So I think there's a lot beyond formal education that's needed to keep ourselves abreast of changes and to develop our skills.
Doesn't mean necessarily that one needs as much dedication and time spent as one does on formal education to get to a high level of skills. A lot of it can be learned and probably should be learned by assignments on the job, provided, of course, that one's pushing that energy in the right direction. That's part of what the map is here to help with. Capability management as a whole looks at three things: trying to work out where you want to get to long term, and then look at where you are with your team capabilities, and then you want to close the gap. And we talk here about the team, and that's really one side of it, and we'll be looking at that later on. Right now, though, let's have a quick look at an individual, because it's probably easier to empathize and understand this from the point of view of one individual trying to understand their own long-term needs and development plans against where they are now and building a gap to go ahead and develop themselves. So here's Wendy Hayer. She is a solution designer for Acme Inc. Guys, I'm sorry we couldn't have anything more spectacularly innovative than Acme Inc. is our name, but at least you know that we're making it up. This is not a real person. We would always keep everybody's data, and this is a very serious point, confidential, and also it can be deleted at any point that anybody wants to. So Wendy Hayer is a fictitious person. She, as an individual, might want to go and assess her skills. Fine. So she goes to the capability map. She can go to it with a direct long URL through the website, or indeed using that short bit.ly URL there. Clicks on one of the links, goes through to the website, and having registered is then presented with a screen where we talked earlier about there being 25 skills in 5 categories across 4 levels. That's quite a lot of information, but it's laid out very simply thanks to our partner Lexonis. You can see their logo top right, who make this possible for us. So you can see here that if she was looking at curation and thought that was a skill that she should be assessing herself against, and we'll come a little later on to discuss when you would assess yourself against a skill, she's assessing herself against curation, and she looks at the 3 levels there, and by hovering over the advanced button or the advanced cell there, she can see that there are certain behaviors associated with that which are, as we say, visible. These are observable behaviors. So we don't talk in the capability map about you understand something or you have a certain amount of experience. It's all about what people actually do. Thanks for the URL, Michelle. And you'll also notice that top right, there's the opportunity to download the competency profile report. So once she's gone through this and assessed herself against the map, she can get a view on paper, which she can save. And I've met people who've done this. It's quite extraordinary going around the world. I bumped into people in Singapore who said, yes, every year I go to the map and I reassess myself to work out where I am. I check myself against my previous year's report, and that shows me how I'm developing myself. In addition, if she wants to, she can click on a skill and drill down. You can see here that supporting work teams has a list of, quite a short list of behaviors for each of the 4 levels. And also at the bottom, there's this comments box. Add a comment, optional. And if you want to, you can add a comment either to make notes about your own skill level, so that's for your future reference, you can come back to it, or you can provide feedback to us. So you can say, actually, I think you can improve these skills definitions in some areas, you've missed something out. Here is something else you should be thinking about. So that's it, very simple. Michelle, I think which would take about what, maybe 20 minutes to go through, or possibly a little bit longer. How long do you think it would take to assess yourself?
Yeah, I think a little bit longer. I did it, when I did mine, it was about half an hour. And of course, I'm already familiar with a lot of these skills. So the people I've been working with in organisations, 30 to 45 minutes to really think carefully about each skill, have a look at the statements. And some of the feedback I'm getting, Don, from people who are starting to use the map is even just completing their assessment is they're learning things about what L&D does and perhaps challenging some of their assumptions about their own role. So that in itself is worthwhile. Putting aside a decent amount of time to do it.
Absolutely right, Michelle. And you can see that, look, that's one skill of 25 laid out there. It's not a lot of words. So that 30 to 40 minutes is not spent reading, it's spent thinking and reflecting. Pretty important point. And you're right, Michelle, actually, because we made an effort this time to really focus on emergent skills, we're really showing people some of the extra things that a department should be thinking about to be effective in the 21st century. So Wendy goes to the website, does her assessment, and she can download her report, her personal report. It looks like this, her skills profile, and she can save that as a PDF. And as I said, look at it again in the future to see where she's got to. If you're a member of the LPI, it's also possible to request a personalized benchmark report. This shows you what your assessment looks like against the benchmark of everybody else who's done it. So you can see how your skills stack up internationally with all these other 500 people now, and of course in the future will be several thousand people who've done it. That's where we get to as an individual. And we've looked at that deliberately because, of course, as an individual, we can understand that and it's fairly accessible. But we also want, don't we, Michelle, to look at team capability and building that out strategically.
Absolutely. And it's important that, the individual assessment is the building block of your team assessment. And all of your team members, if you're doing a team assessment, all of your team members will need to do their individual assessment. And then there's some extra steps to really think strategically about the so what question. Well, what does that mean? This is the skill set my people have, but what does that mean for me in terms of meeting my strategic goals? So we've been working on our process and toolkit around that, and we start working our way through a 5-step process. Now, the process I'm going to introduce here for team assessment, which we've worked up and are recommending people apply, for a small team, if you choose to do the assessment on your own, this would still be a start point for you in terms of good practice for doing the team assessment. And I'll talk in a moment about if you have a slightly bigger team, some of the tools and support that is available from the LPI to perform this team assessment. So Don, let's walk briefly through these 5 phases of the team assessment and some of what's involved. The discovery phase is where you really sit down and think about context. Where are we heading with our learning strategy? Where does learning fit into our organisational culture? What have we got coming up? What are we working on in the next 12 to 24 months, say? And falling out of that, what are some of our requirements for the kind of skills we're going to need to really execute on all of that effectively? So building up that vision of what do we need to deliver on where we're headed. We move then into the data collection phase. And in order to collect the data, you need to ask yourself some questions around role mapping and who needs what skills in the team. This is more for when you get into analysis. Important to set the scene well for your team as to why you are doing it. So there's some communications planning required. People do their self-assessments, and I will talk in a little while about the importance of having those assessments validated if you're going to use them for a team assessment, and getting your managers to take a look over their direct report self-assessments to make sure that they've got the assessment about right. So you're working with valid data. And then we move into an analysis phase. So you've got everybody's individual assessments. You've previously thought about what you need from a team perspective to meet your strategy moving forward. So then it's time to have a good look to see, well, where are our gaps? Where are our opportunities and strengths? And what insights do we have here? And to share that at an executive level as appropriate. Having looked at your gaps and your opportunities, then there's planning time. So in order to address those gaps and to leverage those opportunities, what could we do with development, with resourcing? Do we need to have a think about org design and reshaping some of our positions? Are there any other actions we need to take? And then, of course, you want to be able to sustain that moving forward. So having a plan moving forward, looking at what did we learn out of doing it this time? How often are we going to review that? And making sure you're set up to execute on all of that action planning. So that's the step, the key steps that we're recommending. Don, has anything come up there in the chat that it would be important to address at the moment about those key stages?
Well, John's asked a really interesting question about the discovery phase. I think it's more to do with overall strategy for the L&D department, but it's a good question. How about the branding of the department? Now, that's not directly related to the skills, but it is part, isn't it, of the discovery process. You want to find out how is the department perceived and how should it be perceived? How do you want it to be perceived in the organisation?
Yeah, I think that is important. And I think that also helps when you're looking at some of the skills around strategy and operations in the capability map, and how critical when you start prioritising skill development. Are we in a position where we're not perceived well and we need to make sure we've got strong skills in marketing and communications? Do we need some assistance?
And also in stakeholder management, which came up earlier on. Plenty of people talking about the need for L&D to be perceived in the right way, to be seen to be a business partner, and that's all part of what Jorn is highlighting here. This need to be seen as a go-to department and being seen to be accepted sensibly and seriously by the business. And you can do that if you've got the right skills in the department.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's take a look at some of the additional support that is available should you be in a position to want to get some more support. So we have available for you accredited consultants through the Learning and Performance Institute. And of course, my picture is there because I'm fortunate to have that relationship with the LPI and can work with you. And we have a toolkit in place. And I'd like to share just a handful of the kind of tools that have been developed to use to make the whole assessment process more effective and streamlined. So certainly at the data collection phase, we're going to take a look at the role mapping tool, which I think is really critical and eases the analysis considerably. With the analysis, there's a couple of key tools there, which Don, you're going to walk through around heat maps and spider charts that really help to get the best quality insight into the collated or aggregated set of skills across your team, as well as individual skills. So you'll see some of the tools there. There are more there. And we are using them with a number of clients. Don, you've done a large assessment with Fujitsu. I'm working with a couple of organisations here in Australia with medium-sized teams at the moment. So we're refining those tools, but finding them very effective already.
I've got to say, one of the key tools there, it sounds boring, it sounds obvious, but the communications templates. If you're going to do this yourself, we're very happy, and the Institute is committed to making the tool free for individual use, and you can combine that individual use together to get a view of your team. But please, before you kick off, think about the communications and think how you're going to set things right for your team before they do it, because going back and getting people to look at it again can become a bit complicated. Michelle, I'm just trying to reiterate something I know you're really good at, which is that whole communications piece up front.
Yeah, absolutely. And, making sure people are aware of why they're being asked to do the assessment, probably on top of normal performance management processes, and how the assessment results are going to be used for the benefit of the team. There can be, particularly in a larger team, the potential for misunderstanding and concern about that. So really important to get that messaging right, to get everybody on board and bought in and get really accurate assessments being fed into the data.
Michelle, do you want to just answer Sean's question about strategy and getting key stakeholders involved from outside the department on how they perceive L&D's role now and in the future?
I don't think it's essential to do that as part of the capability assessment, although I would expect that should be a conversation which you're already having. And I'm finding the organisations I'm working with, by the time they get to the point of wanting to do a capability assessment, that they do have a good sense of that and have been in touch with stakeholders. So not essential, but certainly valuable would be my view on that.
There we go. All right, let me pick it up and talk about this first business of how do we get a view of our long-term capability needs. We're thinking about that in terms of the capability map. We've got 25 skills at 4 levels. So we've got a little circle here that says, let's visualize our long-term capability needs. The capability map gives us a quite concrete way of looking at that. Some of the questions on the left here, how far into the future do you want to look? And it might be a matter of a year, 2 years. I think beyond that might be a bit difficult. Certainly you want to be looking at where the change is happening. And here's a key question. I know, Michelle, you've done a great job with this when you've used the map in the past yourself. What do we want to be doing differently? We're doing stuff now. How do we want to be different in the future? What are the strategic goals that will come from us acting differently? And what's the work plan to get there? What else is changing around us? These are some of the questions which we need to be asking ourselves. And on the right-hand side here, you can see that here are the 25 skills, and we've got the 4 levels. What will happen is, if we do the work right, and we look at the different positions we have in the organization, we assign skills to them, and we aggregate all those together, what we end up with is a view for how many people we need to have how many skills at what level. It might look something like this, a heat map of target future skills. This is if you like, a production of the combination of everybody's everybody's position with the skills at certain levels being aggregated. And so you might have like 20 people, for example, perform all their positions pulled together, producing a target future skills map that looks something like this. All right, fine. How do we actually get to that? Let's take a step back and look at the business of role mapping, which, Michelle, I know you've done a lot of work with and is essential as a building block for making sure we can get to that skills map, that target state that we want to achieve. Now, we're going to talk about 3 things here: skills, roles, and positions. And let's say we've got a couple of roles, a consultant, a content designer. That could also be a position. Your position might be that you are a consultant. But let's come back to positions in a second. Firstly, those roles do not consist of single skills in their own right. Typically, a role will consist of more than one skill bundled together at a certain level. A consultant, you might be required to know about enabling change at quite a high level, and you probably want to know about performance consulting, certainly at least at the level of proficiency. Content designer, similarly, you can see there are skills associated with that. It might be that, of course, you've got positions which are combinations of roles. Certainly you can have a position which is just one role, but a lot of positions consist of one or more roles put together. And it's no joke to say that a lot of people running learning and development departments, you've got 1, 2, 3, 4 people trying to do every possible role. And so their positions naturally are groups of roles put together. Wendy herself is a solution designer, meaning that she's got those 2 different roles, the consultant and the content designer piece, brought together into solution designer. And that means she's got a certain combination of skills that she's supposed to have. The question is, at what level does she need those skills to be? Foundational, proficient, advanced, or leading? This is where if we were sitting down and helping you with this as consultants, we would use a role mapping tool that enables us to look at a range of different roles here. And you can see here that there are a few roles, 5 or 6 5 or 6 skills associated with each role. And those roles could be a position in their own right. They could be a unit that goes together to make up another position. So sitting down with somebody and helping them understand the positions, the roles, and the skills in their organization, we'd sit down with this quite long list of potential roles, and then we'd go to the mapping exercise of building up a position. And in this case, we're putting together a consultant and a content designer to form a new position, which is a solution designer. And if you look at, for example, the skill towards the bottom there, performance consulting, you can see that the consultant role requires performance consulting level 3, content design requires it at level 2. So the tool we have takes the larger of those 2 and says, right, you need to have, for this particular position you're building, performance consulting at level 3. Michelle, you've been using this recently. Is there anything there which I've missed out in this very brief overview of what's quite a complicated process?
Yeah, I just wanted to make the point that we've created quite a long list. I think we're up to about 20 different roles in our standard template at the moment. And we've done some generic skill mapping against all of those roles. That's really just a start point to fast track building the positions in an intelligent way for each organisation. And those roles and the skill levels can be adapted before you even start looking at the positions. But I shared this last week, this tool, and went through the position building process with the leader of an L&D team, and he just said to me, I wish I'd had this 2 years ago when I was doing my org design. This would have made life a whole lot easier to do the thinking that was required.
I've done this with other organisations, not in this field of IT, learning skills, but in the field of IT skills. And that is the feedback we got again and again, which was just building organisations, understanding how we're putting our job descriptions together benefits so much from this approach. So we can see there, we've got Wendy's 8 skills at the level they're required at for her particular position. If we go back to that map we saw earlier, this is what Wendy's own position, her single position, would look like on that map. You can see that there is 1 in each of the cells, meaning that there's 1 person, Wendy, with a skill at that level. So actually, it's not talking about Wendy here, sorry, we're talking about her role. So Wendy's role here, Wendy's position here is illustrated on that map on the right-hand side by saying you need to have, you've got 1 person who's got creating content at level 3, all the way down to at the bottom there, you've got performance consulting, 1 person at level 3 for that particular skill. The reason I'm dwelling on that is that we're going to obviously carry on and then build this up. So that's what Wendy's position would look like. We might then aggregate everybody else's skills in there that are associated with their positions, and that's what we'd end up with. If you take the ideal skill set required for each position, put them together, that's our target future skill set for the department. Now, there are some caveats associated with what we do with that next, and I'll come on to that in a second. But first, Michelle, do you want to just talk about the actual process of assessing the team capability?
Yeah, absolutely. Before I do that, I just wanted to point out we've gone through a fair bit of sort of granular detail there.
We have.
Through how to build up positions from roles and that the skills are associated with the roles. One of the reasons I was keen to share that with you is that regardless of your choice around doing this kind of work independently, doing your assessment independently or reaching out for some support, it's really important, I think, to understand the logic that's required and to do that thinking up front so you've got a valid target state that you can assess your team capabilities against. So hopefully you've been able to follow that process, that thinking, the logic through, and be able to think about how would you reach that same point of definition if you're going to do this independently with your small team. Really critical to do that thinking.
It's a good point. It's a good point, well worth making. And of course, we should also say, of course, that this is one fictional target skills profile for one fictional target, one fictional L&D department. They're all going to be different, aren't they, Michelle?
Yeah, absolutely. It's going to depend on things like the size of your team, your learning strategy, your business structure, so many factors that could affect it. So important for each organisation to do its own thinking on this. So we're at the point now where we've done some work on visualising our long-term capability needs. It's time to assess our team capabilities. Don, if we look at the next slide and some of the key steps in the process and the considerations I'd like to talk about, each individual goes ahead and does their own self-assessment, and you can be doing this in parallel while you're building up your future state, so long as when you start analysing your team capabilities, you've done your future state thinking as the basis to do that analysis and identify gaps and opportunities. So each individual would self-assess. We're strongly recommending you have a manager validate that assessment, and that's to ensure some reliability in the assessments. It also fits, it's very coherent and consistent with the performance management process. If you're in an organisation that uses 360-degree assessment as a standard thing, you may want to consider using some peer assessment but we would strongly recommend that you align the validation of the individual assessments with your normal processes of performance management and development planning. There may be a need after the manager sits with the individual, has a look at their assessment, for the individual to go in and update some of their assessments. Many people tend to be hard on themselves. Perhaps they've overlooked some experience they've had and underrated their skills. Others may be a little bit overgenerous. So it helps to get that right. As Don said, the setup is really critical, and we would strongly recommend you spend some time thinking about the messaging and getting very clear with your people, communicating with them why you're doing it, how it be used, and privacy. And there are some statements on the LPI website about the stringency around privacy from an LPI handling perspective. Sean, that question you asked about stakeholder input, it may be appropriate at this point to have some communication with some of your stakeholders as well, and to invite some of them in when you do the analysis, and to kind of validate the gaps and insights and where you're thinking of heading in terms of some of your strategies to close those gaps. I think that's a really valuable point to be having a stakeholder discussion. There are some things to think about in terms of guidelines to your people with self-assessment as well. It may be, when we looked at Wendy, she had a couple of specific roles mapped to her position, a set of 8 skills. It may be that Wendy has experience and skill in things that are outside of her role. Do you want people to assess against those as well? The other question is that people are coming up with as well, when I look at this particular skill, so we looked at curation before, I've got most of the behavioural statements I'm aligned with at proficient level, but I'm also about 75% of the way there against advanced. What should I do in that case? Where do you want me to assess myself? So think about some of those assessment guidelines to get some consistency again. So that was about as much as I wanted to say at this point. I'm not seeing any more questions about guidance and setting this up right, but we'll have time definitely for some questions at the end today. So if there are questions, we can come back to this whole question around how do you set this up for success.
Yeah, I know we're very excited about this business of skills and roles and positions. It sounds terribly granular. It is crucial. And this process here that Michelle's just gone through is absolutely crucial to make sure that you're getting data which is consistent across your team. Especially if you've got a team that's got one layer of management in it. You want to make sure that the people who are assessing team A are approaching it the same way as the people assessing team B.
Yeah.
Let's look at Wendy and the results of what she's done. She's assessed herself. Also, her manager has done this business of taking skills and mapping them to roles and putting the roles together into a position. Does Wendy's personal skill profile map what's required for her role? Well, we can pull out a spider diagram from the data that we collect, and we can see here that, and this is not untypical for somebody who's come in from a traditional L&D background. The orange line at the bottom there represents the profile of Wendy's current skill set, and the blue line is what's required for the job. And as I was saying, for somebody who's done a traditional L&D job, you can see that she's perhaps unsurprisingly quite expert in the field of both curation and creating and matching content. She's got a good handle on content. Great. That's only part of what's required for a solution designer. It's also true that on her performance consulting and enabling change, which are two slightly more strategic and obscure skills, she's not as well developed. And she's at a level 2 on both of those, where the role requires that to be a level 3. So looking at that, it's pretty clear that Wendy could sit down with her manager and could say, look, I'm good at the job. There are areas where I could improve. What can I do to boost my skills in performance consulting and enabling change? Now, the first reaction is typically, let's go and put her on a course, but there are a whole range of things that an individual can do to build that skills gap. We can provide suggestions for that. And in fact, of course, Michelle, it's also possible, isn't it, for the team itself to provide ways of bridging the gap in skills, isn't it? And you've done that yourself in the past.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, in addition to individual development planning, when we look at the team's needs as a whole, there's also an opportunity to create a team development plan, and to do that in such a way that the team owns the development plan and is able to drive it moving forward. That's certainly something I'm working with organisations on at the moment.
So rather than the manager imposing it, the team itself feels enabled, and it feels very positive about this prospect of going out and developing its skills.
Absolutely.
So that's the individual output. Typically an important part of it is an individual development plan. There are other things we can do with the data at an individual level, such as succession planning, role planning, and so on. If you've got this skill level, what other skill what other role, what other position in the organization do you best fit? That's a clear use of the data, but the most obvious and most typical immediate use is to build a development plan. But what about the team? We've talked quite a lot about this target future state of what an organization thinks it should be going for. What we've done, if you remember, to get to this map of skills on the left-hand side, is to say, if we take all of the positions we've got and we put those skills on there individually, and then we multiply that by the number of people we've got who should be in those positions, what's our target future state? Well, this is what it looks like for this fictional organization. And then against that, we compare what our current state actually is. And you can see here that it's patchy. It's not as well laid out as the target state. We've got, as is quite typical, some areas where there are a lot of preponderance of skills, and other areas where it's really quite weak. And the trick then is to take some analysis and to compare the two and come up with something that's sensible and valuable for the organization, what we call the planned future state. Just have a quick look at this, and obviously we could spend several hours looking at this process of comparing where we are with where we want to get to and building a plan. One clear thing is that you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. You can see on the target state on the left-hand side, there's a certain amount of managing and creating content that's required, a certain skill level. We, in our current state, well exceed that, and that's not untypical with organizations that come from a traditional training background. And so the planned future state just echoes the current state. There is no reason why we should try to get rid of those skills. We've got a surfeit of skills there. Great, we'll keep them. But in other areas, like for example with learning and development strategy, we can see that's a bit patchier. We haven't got the strategic level, and in fact all of the skills we've got in the current state for L&D strategy are at a lower level than our ideal target state. And so you can see in the planned future state, what the algorithm has done is said, well, what we'll do is we will boost we'll take out all those people, move them up a level effectively, and have one person coming at level 1 as support. And that's a close match to the L&D strategy. In fact, it's exactly what we officially set out to do with the target state. So, just seeing if anything's come through on the chat there. Yeah, and that's Michelle talking about the heat maps. And you're right. I love what you say there. The data, Michelle, enables better conversations. That's what it's all about. Michelle, we're not in a position where we put data in, press a button, and a plan comes out for the department. It's always about providing input for conversation and strategy.
Yeah, absolutely.
Finally, if you've got a large-scale implementation, and this is true if you've got, let's say, well, if you've got lots of people particularly distributed in an organization, then rather than working with the institute by itself to prepare the sort of heat maps and spider diagrams we've talked about, we'd go to Lexonis and agree with them to have an installed version of this on your site. Then what happens is the tools, the reports become available immediately to managers who've been given rights to the reports, and they're at their fingertips to pull down heat maps, to pull down competency analysis, and also to look at the possible learning interventions that might be mapped to an individual, and also to prioritize those. There's a lot you can do with it. That's probably a separate conversation in its own right. We're wrapping up now with probably about 5 to 10 minutes for questions. Michelle, do you just want to pick up the final few slides?
Absolutely. Thanks, Don. So there's three options for you to pick from in terms of what's right for you, for yourself and your team. The first, of course, is to use the existing free assessment platform and the reports, which may well suffice for your needs. And the LPI, of course, is absolutely committed to keeping the individual self-assessment and the personalised reports free for everyone to use. The second option is to partner with the LPI to utilise the support of a consultant and the toolkit to explore the future skill needs of your department. And the third option for a larger, particularly distributed L&D team is to partner with the LPI and Lexonis to use their platform to be able to access a lot more of the analysis directly yourself. So those are the options. And in terms of next steps, there is a PDF which you can download, a guide to the capability map that is available on the LPI website. Perhaps, Don, if you can pop the URL back into the chat while I'm sort of summarising. That guide gives you some background to the capability map as well as a full set of descriptions for every one of the 25 skills. Go in and explore the capability map for yourself if you haven't already done so. Do your own self-assessment as a start point. And then if you'd like to discuss further, I've popped my email address there, or you can contact the LPI directly in the UK on the info@thelpi.org email. Which wraps up the content, the kind of the whole set of ideas, processes, as tips and suggestions we wanted to share today for using the capability map to build your L&D department and to meet some of the challenges for the future. So we are open and available for comments, feedback, thoughts, questions at this point.
And I rather brilliantly managed to get my URL wrong there, but I got it right second time around. Michael says, the self-assessment's great, easy to complete, peer validation or stakeholder validation is there. Is there an existing function to allow me to send a URL to my assessment to specific peers? Gosh, Michael, no, there isn't. It's a great idea. By including details on their role and its relationship to my role would also allow the calculation of confidence level percentage, which would be valuable to both benchmarking. It's a great idea, Michael. It doesn't happen at the moment. We'll take it back to Lexonis and suggest that as a great bit of additional functionality they could be thinking about. Yeah, thank you for sticking around, and I'm delighted that clearly you've done the self-assessment.
Yep. Don, one of the things I'm working with at the moment, they're sort of they have fairly open relationships around who's doing what and who's got what experience, and they're actually getting together in small peer groups and projecting the assessment up on a screen and getting each other's input as they do the peer review. But they are also ensuring that they do the manager validation on top of that.
Oh, that's pretty bold, I have to say. And they must have a great culture to do that.
Yeah, they do. They do. Yeah. Jorn's given us a comment. I really like the framework. We'll be using the capability overview and map towards the LinkedIn learning courses. So we've got learning paths for the whole L&D team. Yeah, certainly.
That sounds really interesting.
Yeah.
I was going to say, Jorn, if you want to keep in touch with Michelle. We'd love to know about the mappings you make, and we'd love to know about how that works out for the L&D team, because I think the more as a community we can come together and collate the idea of what assets are out there to help people develop, the better. I think that's a great idea. Michelle, what's your view on that?
Yeah, look, we've spoken about some of my global aspirations about this. I've got this vision of a global community of learning and development professionals who are, curating resources, skills, having conversations around each of these 25 skills. I think there's real potential these days with the resources that are available and with the way we can build our networks globally to do that. I know the LPI is looking at developing more programs specifically around the capabilities, each of the capabilities, and also looking at that issue of curation, which sounds like, where you're heading, Jorn, with being able to map specific courses that you already have available against the different capabilities. I think that's a fabulous idea. Okay, do we have any other final questions or thoughts? Yes, we do, from Marianne. Done the self-assessment. I'm not employed in L&D at the moment and would like to know if there's any way of validating the self-assessments to assist in action planning. Marianne, I would recommend, this is a really good opportunity for a little bit of, even if it's ad hoc mentoring, to approach someone who is working in learning and development. If you need some assistance to identify someone, if you're not sure, who's out there in the network, I'm very happy if you contact me to help you to connect with someone to perhaps do some validation. But certainly we're a pretty helpful bunch in the learning and development profession. I think we've got a good community, a good network. So you will be able to reach out to people is what I would recommend as a start point. So please get in touch.
It's a really good idea, that. And again, Marianne, I'd be very interested in hearing about your development, your process that you go through on that, and how you end up developing yourself. And I'd also be very happy to help you out if you want to just get in touch on LinkedIn, on everything else. I'm Donald H. Taylor. I say that, don't contact me this week when I am absolutely snowed under, but from next week, life's a bit better. It'd be great to be in touch. There's nothing gives me more pleasure than finding great people, helping them stay in the industry and contribute to it.
Absolutely. So, Don, thank you so much. It must be almost midnight there. So I think we'll let you go before you Really
great to be with you guys. Yeah. Thank you very much for everyone's input. And it's been a pleasure, Michelle, as always, to be with what's always a really vibrant community, the Australian and indeed the regional L&D team. Yeah, Michelle, over to you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, everyone. Please stay connected. There's many ways, as with Don, of getting in touch with me: email, Twitter, LinkedIn. Let's continue the conversation and make sure in our region we get the most value out of the capability map as a tool to help us staying vibrant, relevant, and engaged with our stakeholders and delivering more value. So I look forward to seeing many of you in the coming lead up to Christmas. There's quite a few events on. And staying connected. Thank you again.